Story 1. David and Kelly were excited when they moved into their new home. The quiet, tree-lined street seemed like the perfect place to raise their two young children, a fresh start away from the busyness of city life. The neighborhood seemed warm and welcoming, and for the first few weeks, everything was perfect. That is, until the strange letters started arriving. It began innocuously enough, a single note left in their mailbox and signed. "I know where you go," it read. David crumpled it up, thinking it was some neighborhood kid playing a prank. But then another letter appeared a few days later, this one even more unsettling. "Your family looks so happy through the window." Now Kelly was on edge, and they both started feeling watched. David reported it to the police, but without any leads or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The police suggested installing cameras, which they promptly did, placing them around the front and back of the house. The neighborhood seemed too quiet for something like this to be happening, and the feeling of being spied on was getting under their skin. Weeks passed, and the notes escalated. One described David's daily routine in excruciating detail. What time he left for work, when Kelly took the kids to the park, even the type of coffee David drank in the mornings. Then came the package, a framed picture of their family, clearly taken through their own window. Whoever was doing this wasn't just watching them, they were close. The police investigated again, but found no fingerprints, no footage of anyone near their property. Nothing. David began eyeing their neighbors. Could it be the family across the street with the teenage son, who always seemed to be lurking? Or maybe it was the elderly couple 2 houses down, whose curtains were always tightly drawn. His suspicion grew, but there was no solid evidence pointing to anyone. One evening, Kelly went to bed early, but David stayed up late, reading in the living room. He heard a noise outside and, heart pounding, rushed to the window. Standing in the yard was a shadowy figure, watching the house. David's breath hitched, but by the time he blinked and reached for his phone, the figure had disappeared into the night. After that, the harassment grew even more disturbing. One morning, they found a dead animal, a mutilated cat, on their porch. Kelly was horrified, and David was on edge. Their children were scared to go outside. The police seemed as helpless as ever, offering to increase patrols but still with no solid leads. David began watching their neighbors more closely, especially one in particular, Mr. Langley, the quiet man who lived across the street. Langley was strange, but he had never seemed threatening. He was always polite, if a bit distant, but he was one of the few neighbors who lived alone. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him, though. Langley never interacted with anyone, always kept to himself. And he seemed to know when David was watching, often appearing at his window, staring blankly at David's house for just a bit too long. One night things came to a head. David was woken in the middle of the night by a loud crash. He bolted out of bed and rushed downstairs, only to find the living room window shattered. On the floor was a brick, and wrapped around it was a letter. This one was different. It was handwritten, scrawled messily with a disturbing message. "Your family will be next." Shaking, David called the police. They arrived quickly this time, but while they combed through the evidence, something strange happened. One of the officers noticed something about the handwriting on the letter, an unusual, jagged flourish on certain letters. It looked familiar to him, too familiar. David's heart sank as the officer asked to see any other handwritten documents they had from neighbors, particularly signatures. David scrambled to find a stack of old neighborhood letters, the usual welcome notes and signatures from neighbors when they had first moved in. The officer compared them, his face growing serious. A chill ran down David's spine when the officer handed him the envelope from Mr. Langley. The signature on Langley's welcome card matched the jagged, distinctive writing of the threatening letter. David was stunned. Mr. Langley? The quiet, unassuming man across the street? The police searched Langley's house later that week, and the discovery was even worse than they had imagined. Hidden in his basement was a chilling cache of surveillance equipment, photos, and personal belongings from several families in the neighborhood, including David's. Langley had been watching them for months, documenting their lives with meticulous precision. But the most horrifying discovery was what the police uncovered about Langley's past. Langley had served in Iraq, part of a covert intelligence unit, and had been honorably discharged after a traumatic event in which his entire unit had been killed in an ambush. The man had come back from the war deeply disturbed, paranoid, and unable to let go of the sense of constant surveillance and control he had lived with overseas. It turned out Langley had been running his own twisted version of reconnaissance on his neighbors. For years, Langley had been spying on different families, leaving threatening messages, and in some cases harassing them until they moved away. The notes, the photos, the disturbing escalation. It was all part of a sick game he had been playing, unable to escape the war that had ravaged his mind. The things he had done in Iraq, the covert operations, and the atrocities he had witnessed had twisted him into something unrecognizable. David was left shaken to his core. The quiet, peaceful neighborhood they had moved to had hidden a monster in plain sight. And all along, the man who had watched them with dead eyes had been planning his next move. Story 2. I'm a first responder, been doing this job for almost 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange and unsettling scenes. But there's one call that sticks with me more than most, one that still sends a chill down my spine every time I think about it. It was late afternoon when the dispatch came through a welfare check at a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The elderly tenant, an old woman named Mrs. Grayson, hadn't been seen in weeks. Neighbors complained of a foul odor coming from her unit, so we were called to investigate. When we arrived, the landlord was waiting for us, visibly nervous. "She never comes out," he said. "I don't know how long it's been, maybe a month? Maybe longer?" He handed over the key, but the moment we got to the door, I knew we were in for something bad. The stench was overpowering, that unmistakable smell of death. We had to steel ourselves before opening the door. Inside, the apartment was dark and cluttered, as if time had frozen in place. The air was thick, heavy with decay. It was obvious that Mrs. Grayson had been dead for a while. We found her almost immediately. She had hanged herself in the center of the living room, her body bloated and stiff. But that wasn't the worst part. As we carefully searched the apartment, we found strange things that made my skin crawl. Dead animals, all in various states of decomposition, were scattered around the room. Cats, birds, even a squirrel. They weren't just dead. They'd been mutilated. The animals were arranged in strange patterns on the floor, surrounded by what looked like dried blood and symbols painted on the walls. Then there were the children's toys. Dozens of them, all old and worn, piled in a corner of the room. At first glance, they seemed innocent enough, but when we looked closer, we realized something horrifying. Each toy had been altered, stuffed animals with their eyes gouged out, dolls missing limbs, and some with nails driven into their heads. It was like Mrs. Grayson had turned them into some kind of twisted voodoo figures. What really unsettled me, though, were the children's names, written on scraps of paper, pinned to the walls, and placed under the toys. These weren't just random toys. They were from the neighborhood kids. The names corresponded to children who lived in the building. Kids who played outside every day, completely unaware of the darkness festering in the apartment just a few doors down. One of the worst moments came when we opened a small closet in the hallway. Inside, there was a mirror with what looked like dried blood smeared across the glass. Arranged in a circle around the mirror were photographs, images of those same children playing in the courtyard outside. Some were taken from windows, others from behind trees. All of them were watching, waiting. We learned later that Mrs. Grayson had been a recluse for years. No family, no visitors. The police uncovered evidence suggesting she had become obsessed with dark rituals over the last decade, using animal sacrifices as part of some twisted belief system. The toys, they said, were likely a form of sympathetic magic, voodoo in a way. She had apparently convinced herself that the children in the building were somehow tied to the bad energy she felt around her, that they needed to be protected or punished. But the most chilling discovery came when the coroner did a deeper investigation into her death. They found symbols carved into her skin, self-inflicted. She had been performing these rituals on herself, too. It was clear she had been battling demons in her mind, losing herself to whatever dark path she had followed. The idea that someone could live like this, unnoticed for so long, still haunts me. She was just there, and none of us ever really knew what kind of horrors were unfolding behind that door until it was too late. I don't know what Mrs. Grayson thought she was doing with those toys or what she believed the rituals were meant to achieve, but what we found that day will never leave me. Sometimes it's not the dead bodies that get to you. It's what they leave behind. And what Mrs. Grayson left behind was something that still lingers in the air of that apartment complex, a darkness that no amount of cleaning could ever truly erase. Story 3. James and his wife, Sarah, had just moved into their dream home in a peaceful, remote neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other, kids played in the streets, and everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. The first time James met their neighbor, Mr. Fisher, the man seemed normal enough. He was a middle-aged guy, a bit reserved but friendly. He lived alone in a small, old house with thick curtains always drawn shut. Fisher would often wave when he saw James working in the yard, but that was about the extent of their interactions until Fisher began showing up everywhere. At first, it was subtle. James would be out for a jog early in the morning, and there was Fisher, walking down the same road, staring at James with his hands tucked in his coat pockets. Once or twice, James even waved, but Fisher just watched him, never waving back. Then, one evening, as James was pulling into his driveway, he noticed Fisher standing at his window, watching them with the same blank stare. Sarah brushed it off, thinking the man was probably just lonely. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Things escalated when James started finding odd things around his property. One morning, he found a dead bird on their doorstep, its wings splayed out unnaturally, like it had been placed there deliberately. A few days later, a pair of muddy footprints led from the sidewalk directly to their back door, even though they had no visitors. One night, when Sarah was out of town, things took a turn for the worse. James was alone, reading in the living room, when he heard a faint knock at the back door. It was late, too late for anyone to be knocking, and his stomach tightened. He stood up and crept toward the door, peeking through the window. No one was there, but then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement near the side of the house. He quickly locked the door and closed all the blinds, his heart racing. James tried to shake off the fear, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But around midnight, he heard it again, this time a slow creak, like someone was trying to open the back door. His breath hitched. He grabbed a flashlight and his phone, tiptoeing toward the door again. He pressed his ear against it and listened. There was a soft, raspy whisper. "James?" His heart pounded in his ears. "How does he know my name?" He backed away from the door, trying to steady his shaking hands. His phone was ready to dial 911, but a part of him needed to see who was out there. He took a deep breath, and in one swift motion, yanked the door open, shining the flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. The backyard was empty. But the moment he turned to close the door, a figure darted out from behind the corner of the house. Fisher. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and his hand reached out, fingers curled like claws. James stumbled back, slamming the door shut and locking it, adrenaline surging through him. He ran to the front of the house, dialing 911 as he bolted every door and window. The police arrived 15 minutes later, but Fisher was gone. They searched his house and found nothing out of the ordinary, at least on the surface. But behind Fisher's house, they discovered something far more disturbing. Hidden in his shed were dozens of photographs. All of them were of James and Sarah, captured through windows while they were walking in the yard, even while they slept. The most disturbing part was that some of the photos were taken from inside their house. James and Sarah moved away the next week, but the horror of knowing their neighbor had been watching them so closely for so long haunted them both. Even now, James can't shake the feeling that somewhere Fisher is still watching. Story 4. Dan had lived in his quiet suburban neighborhood for several years, barely noticing his next-door neighbor, Mr. Kane. Kane was an unassuming older man, kept to himself, never caused any trouble. But over time, something about him started to seem off. It started with Kane's peculiar questions. One afternoon, as Dan was out mowing his lawn, Kane approached the fence, his voice low. "You head out early every morning, huh?" Dan shrugged, not thinking much of it. Kane followed up with, "You don't have cameras out back, do you?" That question lingered in Dan's mind, but he brushed it off as innocent curiosity. However, things soon escalated. Dan's dog, Max, began to act strangely, growling and barking at the shared fence every night. Max had always been calm, but now he was on edge whenever Kane was nearby. Then, one night, Dan heard a strange noise. It was late, close to 3 a.m., when a soft metallic thud echoed through the darkness. Dan peered out his window to see Kane in his backyard, digging. The dim light from Kane's house cast eerie shadows as he worked, shoveling dirt into a pile. Dan stared for a moment, but when Kane suddenly looked up, eyes wide as if sensing someone watching, Dan quickly ducked behind the curtain, heart racing. The next morning, as Dan let Max out, he noticed something unusual. The patch of dirt near the fence, where Max had been frantically sniffing, had been disturbed. It looked like something had been buried there recently. Dan felt a chill run down his spine, but told himself not to overthink it. Things took a dark turn when a local woman went missing. Her face was plastered on the news, and the last place she was seen? Just a block from Dan's street. The neighborhood buzzed with concern, but something told Dan to keep an extra eye on Kane. That night, as Dan lay in bed, sleep eluded him. His mind raced through every strange interaction he had with Kane. The late-night digging, the weird questions, Max's odd behavior. Suddenly, Dan heard it, a creak. His heart froze as the sound echoed from downstairs. He reached for the baseball bat he kept beside his bed and crept toward the staircase, ears straining. As he descended, his blood ran cold when he saw the back door slightly open, swaying with a night breeze. "I locked that door." "I know I did." With trembling hands, Dan moved toward the door, ready to shut it. But then he noticed the muddy footprints, leading from the door into his kitchen. Panic surged through him. He was no longer alone. A soft shuffling sound came from the kitchen. Dan gripped the bat tighter and took a deep breath, inching closer. And then he saw him. Kane stood in the dim light by the counter, his back hunched, fiddling with something in his hands. A dirty, blood-streaked cloth. Dan's voice cracked. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Kane slowly turned, his eyes wide, pupils dilated, like a cornered animal. "I didn't mean for you to see this," he whispered, his voice shaking but oddly calm. In his hands, Kane held a large knife, its blade smeared with dirt and blood. Dan's stomach twisted as he realized what was happening. Kane had buried something in Dan's yard, something sinister, and now he was here to cover his tracks. Without warning, Kane lunged at Dan, the knife raised high. Instinctively, Dan swung the bat, striking Kane's arm with a sickening thud. The knife clattered to the floor as Kane screamed in pain. Max came bounding into the room, barking furiously, which sent Kane stumbling backward, clutching his arm. Dan seized the moment and ran, bolting out the back door with Max close behind. Dan sprinted down the street, his heart pounding, and frantically called 911. The police arrived within minutes, swarming Kane's property. What they found was beyond horrifying. In the spot where Kane had been digging the night before, they unearthed the missing woman's body, wrapped in plastic, dirt still clinging to her limbs. The police searched Kane's house and uncovered even more gruesome details. A collection of personal items, each tied to disappearances that spanned over the last decade. Kane had been living a double life, a predator hidden behind the guise of a quiet, harmless neighbor. Dan was left shattered by the revelation. He moved out of the neighborhood shortly after, haunted by the fact that he had lived next to a monster. Every time he heard a noise in the night, he couldn't help but wonder how long Kane had been watching him, and what might have happened if he hadn't escaped that night. If you enjoyed these stories, please like and subscribe. Also, check out my other videos.